All right, thanks everybody for coming here, and it's an honor definitely to be speaking to all of you. I think the real question, though, is whether I should be having the honor of speaking to you. So why don't we just deal with that one first. So Orthogon is not a high-frequency trading firm. We do not apply the liquid markets. We don't think about algorithms or data structures or big data. That being said, the GPs of many funds who do that are actually investors in us, and they're investors in us because of what we're telling them, and what we're telling them, I'd love to tell you, no investment required. Now, in a desperate bid to gain some credibility with this audience, I'll talk a little bit about my background. It may comfort you to know that I was broadly trained in things like time series analysis, stochastic processes, Bayesian inference, and signal extraction, and then I gave those things up. Okay? So computer languages became other sorts of languages, and everything seemed to transform, and there was this kind of moment, this coming to Jesus moment that happened. Why did that occur? You can probably guess why, because the people in this audience are pretty smart, okay? I had to coach myself for this audience. Really smart. Smart people make intuitive leaps. You probably can guess at what I'm about to say. But I would caution you, because what I'm going to talk about is a place. It's a magic place, okay? We're going to talk about a magic place. Every time I do this, I'm the genie with the stars coming out of my hand, okay? I'm going to talk about a place where isolating alpha is not a stochastic process, where you're not subject to the whims or caprices of markets, right? Where there's not time to can every strategy that you have, and where regulators might actually invite your activity in rather than police you on it. So let me take you to that place. But in order to take you to that place, I want to talk first about why you're not in that place necessarily already. And in doing that, I'm making a big jump that people here are mostly in the liquid markets. And that's because at some point, the off-ramp to this place was skipped because everybody in this room decided to compete. If at any point in time you interfaced anything that looked like that in your professional life, you decided to compete. What do I mean by that? Well, let's actually talk about what we're competing in, which is a financial market. Okay, so please humor me for a moment. I want to take a few seconds out to actually ask ourselves, we're all in the financial markets all the time. Even if you're asleep, if you're like Christina's firm, the computers are maybe working in some other market, right? So it's probably worth just gut checking what is the purpose of a financial market. Humor me, I'm actually going to take 10 seconds out of my precious speech time so that we all can think up a reason for why the financial markets exist. That being said, this is not going to be a moment of audience participation. Do not worry, I will not call on anyone here, although I do that sometimes when I talk. That's a threat. But let's take 10 seconds right now and just think, what is the purpose of a financial market? Probably for Christina, 10 seconds is an eternity. Typically, there will be about 4 genres of response to this question. If you had thought balloons above your head, and I can imagine them, right? Because I read a lot of comic strip cartoons. The little thought balloons above your head. There's the first group that probably didn't engage in this exercise at all, right? You're like, I'm not going to let some speaker tell me what to think about. For 10 seconds, I'm going to space out. Okay, so there's that group. There's another group that actually probably surprisingly nothing came to your head right away. That's actually a very forgivable response. But nothing came to your head right away, even though you work in the financial markets all the time. There's a third group of people who probably came up with an answer and then immediately thought, oh, that answer is not that good. And it was like embarrassing, like your first attempt to draw something, right? Like, ooh, that doesn't look good, right? And then there's a fourth group of people who may have had a great answer right away for one reason or another. Or you're in that third group of people, but somehow in the 10 seconds that I gave you, you managed to pivot and come up with another answer that, oh yeah, I like that one more. Let's look at that fourth group of people and imagine the thought balloons above your head. Now, I'm a professional economist, which means any definition that you come up with that's a little different than the one that I have, I just don't like. Okay, that's just the way it works. I remember when I was researching how to talk to this particular audience, and I looked at prior summits, there was some panel, I think, on like the search for uncorrelated alpha, and I thought to myself, well, wait a second. All alpha is uncorrelated, right? Isn't that how it works? Alpha is a riskless profit, right? So there's no correlation in it. So I can have quibbles, and I'll probably have quibbles with all the definitions, but this one's more interesting because perhaps we have reasonable facsimiles of what the purpose of a financial market is. But I'm wondering, by a show of hands, if you came up with this two-word definition or a reasonable facsimile thereof as to what my definition is of a financial market, at least for this panel, or at least for this audience. And my definition is the purpose of a financial market is to eliminate alpha. How many people came up with that definition? Okay. For some reason, I don't feel threatened here that nobody did. Okay. I assure you that this definition is very robust to criticism. Let's think about that. Let's suppose we know that an asset is worth $100, and we know that actually can't be the case. We're already in a fantasy land. There's some distribution of guesses around the value of an asset, but I'll just give it to you. Let's just suppose that the value of an asset is worth 100. Well, everybody in this room would love to buy it for 80, except somebody will buy it for 90. Somebody would actually bid 95. Somebody will bid 99, 99.50, 99.99, and then the joker in the room, the game theorist, the mathematician, will bid 100. That's actually the equilibrium outcome, and the asset will trade for 100. Okay? There's also something called the winner's curse, and very careful empirical studies show that people actually go beyond 100 to bid for an asset. A very charitable activity, right? So what, though? So what? Well, it's interesting because all of us are in financial markets, all of us except this person right here on the stage. And what if the purpose of financial markets is one way or another to eliminate alpha, that is riskless profits? And remember, from your Venn diagrams, in order to have a riskless profit, you have to have a profit in the first place. And profit is the difference between price and fair value, right? If that difference is zero, then your profits are zero, so your riskless profits are zero. What's your purpose, though, right? You guys think I was going to get deep on you in the talk? What's your purpose? Well, you might have a private purpose of making as much money as you can, and really all the more power to you. But let me ascribe to you, since this is a monologue, let me ascribe to you a purpose for yourselves that can withstand more public scrutiny, and that might be that you are here to generate alpha. Everybody in this room, investor, investment manager, allocator, what have you, is probably here to generate alpha. Isn't it interesting, or at least it's interesting to me, and we're talking about things that are interesting to me right now, that the very object of your desires, you have located yourself in the most hostile environment to do it in. Isn't that weird? Let's suppose that you are going to be a citrus farmer. Okay, you're going to grow lemons and oranges and, I don't know, other things like, I don't know, bananas and pineapples. Those aren't citrus, by the way. And you said, I want to get cheap land. I'm going to get it in the Gobi Desert or the Sahara, or Death Valley, or the Arctic tundra, or Antarctica. Those would all be terrible places to ply your trade, to grow banana trees. That would be odd, right? That would be strange. That wouldn't be a good decision. But if you're here to generate alpha, and you're putting yourself in a financial market, you're putting yourself in the most hostile environment possible for you to achieve your aim. How did that happen? And the answer is this. The second you decided this Captain Kirk-like interface would be your way of working, you decided to enter a particular world, a world that would deny you what you want to have. Now, if we're going to be like the genie with stars coming out of his left hand and going to go to that different place, I'm going to give you a concrete example of what sort of denizens exist in that place. I'll talk about Charter School Capital. That just happens to be a company I'm very familiar with because we helped start it. Like most companies, Charter School Capital is here to solve a problem, and I'm going to tell you about the solution to that problem and why that's relevant to people who are in the liquid markets. Now, to do that, I'm going to admit something, right? What's the first rule of public speaking? The first rule of public speaking is don't attack your audience. I've probably done that, indirectly or directly 6 times already in the first 10 minutes of the speech. So, I'll just chuck everything out and start breaking all the rules. The second rule is don't read a slide to your audience. I'm now going to read a slide to the audience. This article, which was written in May 9th, 2011, said, in California, there is a persistent and clear pattern of funding inequity for charter schools, ... According to the Ball State study, the funding disparity between charters and traditional schools is, on average, higher than 9% in California. What does that mean? Well, I'll tell you. if you're a traditional public school, what's that? That's the kind of school y'all all are thinking of right now. It's an elementary school, it's a junior high, it's a high school. You can borrow at 1%. They do finance themselves. You can borrow at, let's say, 1%. Well, let's see, I can do math. I used to be really good at math. So that means that charter schools borrow at 10%, right? Because the funding disparity is 9%. So what, right? If a public school borrows at 1 and a charter school borrows at 10, well, the charter school must be like 10 times more risky, right? I mean, that's how markets work. Return is the reward for bearing risk. That's how markets work. And that would be wrong because charter schools are also public schools. They are also instrumentalities of the state. They are also municipal obligations. There is no reason for them to fund at 10% editorial note if they could fund themselves at all. Enter charter school capital. And charter school capital could just go to a school and it could just go to a school and it could say, look, you're borrowing at 10%, how about 5? Now the school's overjoyed because they just cut their funding costs in half, right? Why wouldn't they be happy? But the investor is happy too, right? Because the investor's making 5%, but the investor should only be making 1%. And how many of our businesses here, for every hard-fought basis point of return, every basis point of return that actually is attributable to risk, whether idiosyncratic risk or systematic risk, do you get 4 basis points for free? So for every 1 that you get that you paid for with a risk budget, you get 4 for free. How many businesses do you know like that? Let's remind ourselves how charter school capital operates. First, from the traditional school side, it's really easy. School says, I want money. I want $100. And some state, let's say California, issues a bond for $100. Bondholder buys the bond for $100. That $100 goes to the school. Bondholder pays $100, goes to the school. Now, the point of being a bondholder is to get paid back. So at some point, California raises tax revenues and pays it. Now, interestingly, in the California case, school bonds are quadruple A. That is because California has a waterfall in its state constitution, and schools are ahead of the regular bonds. This meant that during 2008, when California was issuing scrip, it was issuing IOUs to its many, many vendors and even state workers, it was paying schools on time, every time, in cash. We knew that because we were collecting those checks at Charter School Capital. There's no reason for Charter School Capital to reinvent the wheel because it's the same thing, right? So all they do is instead of the state issuing a bond, Charter School Capital issues the bond. And then when California raises the tax revenues, it hands money to CSC that pays back the bondholders. There's no real difference. How about getting back to the liquid markets? Well, let's go through this. So problem, solution. Then at some point, leverage comes in from banks, right? Because a bank says, wait, these bonds pay 5%, but I should only earn 1%. I should buy those. And then in 2018, we have a system that's done billions, that's with a B, of this sort of activity. And securitization with a rating that's incoming, that's A, an A rating, that next year will be A+, and the year after that it'll be AA-, and the year after that it'll be AA, because that's how these things work. And what happens when you have something with a rating that's securitized that's done in the billions? Well, then it can appear on that screen. And all the Captain Kirks can look at it, right? And that's how assets come here. And with that, I'm going to generalize rapidly, right? Everybody here is capable of abstract thought, so I'm going to generalize rapidly from that one case. A review of what is actually occurring. And I've never actually seen this in a textbook, so just mentally think this is copyright Rishi Ganti if this ever gets me like the Nobel Prize. This is how an asset moves into a market, is surfaced into a market. First, the asset actually has to be discovered, right? All those stocks that you trade at some point had to be IPOs, but even before they were IPOs, they had to be somebody's idea. Somebody actually had to create the company. The second thing that happens is origination has to be mechanized, right? By the way, when assets are discovered, that's true for any asset. It's not just true for charter school financing. If you see that 16-year-old baseball player with an amazing swing in the Dominican Republic, boom, you can sign up that kid to a contract he's going to regret for the next 10 years of his life, right? You can do that right there. If you're at a bar in Brooklyn and you hear a great band, right? You can sign them up to a record contract for the next 15 years. You can do that too. You got to discover the asset first. Then you can mechanize it, right? Charter school capital is started to mechanize charter school loans. You decide to move to the Dominican Republic just to check out all the 16-year-old baseball players. Or you start visiting that bar in Brooklyn every Friday night to see if you can get another band. You mechanize origination. After that, crude leverage emerges, like the banks get involved. But then the banks get kicked out, right, once the asset is traded. Banks making loans is not as efficient as something being financed in a market with many, many participants and trillions of dollars operating. And finally, in the nirvana of a particular asset, options may be created off the asset puts and calls. Now, if I were just describing this particular story, I didn't need a two-dimensional chart to do it. I could have just had a ray, because I'm just talking about time stretching out. But I didn't. I have a two-dimensional chart, so what do I mean by here? What about the profitability per unit asset? Well, certainly when the asset is discovered is when you can make the most money off of it. When you discover that band, that baseball player, the new idea, Airbnb, whatever it is, that's when the most money happens. In the Beverly Hillbillies, if you shoot the ground and out comes a bubbling crude, that family is going to Beverly Hills, right? But after that point in time, when the asset's in a market, the intrinsic alpha that's pertinent to the asset is gone. I said that so fast, I'll say it one more time. Once the asset is surfaced into a market, the alpha attached to that asset is gone. When the asset is first discovered, it's alpha rich. That's why you can strike a deal with a charter school or anything, any example, and everybody's better off. The school is better off because it's financing at half its rate. They're happy. But the bondholder is also happy because they're making 5 times as much money as they should be. But once the asset's in the market, that's no longer true, right? In fact, there is a kind of grammatical solecism and a logical error that occurs in everyday speech with people who are in the markets. They'll say, I'm a long-short manager. We make money off stocks. No, actually, you don't make money off stocks. You make money off your trading counterparties to stocks. If you buy a stock here and it goes up, you did not make money off the stock. You made money off the poor schlub who sold you the stock at that price. Isn't that right? Every single position you take, whether short or long, has a trading counterparty on the other side. At this point, there is no alpha pertinent to the asset. You are predating upon your trading counterparty in essentially what is a zero-sum game. Now, in this two-dimensional graph, I also could have labeled, for example, the origin. I could have labeled it 0, 0 at some point, but I didn't. It's because I'm not really sure about it. Well, I know about 1, 0, time. Time goes off to the left, okay, until physics resolves this problem. We only know time flows in one direction. But on profitability, I'm not quite sure. I'm not quite sure where the 0 is per unit asset there. Instead, what I did amorphously was draw the yellow zone of danger. Somewhere in the yellow zone, you're not really making money off the asset. You're making money by being a little smarter, a little faster, a little better than the anonymous trading counterparty that you have on the other side. Let's remember that as we go through the rest of the examples, which I can just manufacture. Now, to keep things simple, I'll just stick with sovereign examples. Remember that in charter school capital, you have some sovereign paying you, like the state of California, the state of Florida, the state of Arizona, and then you buy that sovereign obligation at a trading discount, right? You could own California bonds. They're quadruple A. School bonds in California are rated A1 plus P1. And you can make a few basis points off them, or you can make really about 100 times as much off a private activity. What about in Italy? I mean, I can just keep going. In Italy, the state is involved in lots of things. The state pays for lots of things. It pays for health care. It can pay for electricity under certain programs. It can pay for a zoo. It pays religious orders. And you know what? You can go to one of those payees and say, well, the Italian state owes you 100 euros. How about you take 80 euros for it today? And you know what? They will say yes for lots and lots of reasons. Now, you can own an Italian bond of similar tenor and make about 2%. Or you can own one of these things, which has the exact same credit risk, or arguably is even safer, and make 10 times as much. Now you can have a quibble and say, wait a second, this stuff is illiquid. Okay, I get that. And the Italian bond I can trade in and out of. Yeah, well, there's a price for that illiquidity. It's priced in the market, and it's not much. Okay, so it doesn't really derail my point. It's like less than 100 basis points. What about Brazil? You can end up in the Supreme Court, which looks something like this on a sunny day. And in the Supreme Court, the Brazilian government tends to lose a lot, right? If you show up there, the Brazilian government's on the hook. They're probably going to pay you. You can even win in that court, and the Brazilian government will say, okay, well, we owe you 100 reals, right? And we can go up to you and we can say, how about 80 reals for that? Actually, we can say more like 40 reals for that, because it's going to take a while for them to pay you. Now, you have a choice. You can own a Brazilian bond and get paid. Don't kill me, because I'm not in the markets, so I didn't check Bloomberg today. But you can get paid in US dollar terms, something like 5%, okay? Or you can make 3 to 5 times as much in this private activity. Or in Mexico, the Mexican government is very, very clever on how it gets things done. The United States could learn a lot from Mexico. PPP, public-private partnerships are done. The Mexican government will put something out for bid, like a highway. Now, it takes money to build a highway. That money has to come up front, and you can finance that, and then the group paying you back is the Mexican government. And once again, you can hold a Mexican government bond and get paid, don't crucify me if I'm wrong, about 5% in US dollar terms. Or you can make 3 to 5 times as much. In this private activity, the credit risk is roughly the same. There's some liquidity there as well that you can price in, but otherwise it seems far more lucrative. And I could just go on example after example, but I think you guys get the point. But what is the point? What am I telling you here? First, there is a big difference in financial activity and reward between surfacing an asset and trading an asset, right? That's what we talked about with the Beverly Hillbillies. That's what we talked about with baseball, with 16-year-old baseball players. That's what we talked about with those cool garage bands in Brooklyn. And secondly, volume of assets versus profitability per asset. If you have a highly profitable asset because, let's say, you discovered it, right? You started the fund in your dorm room. Well, that's different. You don't have to do too many of them to make a good living. But if you are in a zone, the Gobi Desert, Death Valley, the Arctic tundra, that is very hostile to your activity, so you can, if on a good day you make a little bit per unit asset, again, predating upon your trading counterparties, then you have to do a lot of those assets to make it work. Now you're in a vicious circle, because in order to find a lot of those assets, you have to go to a bigger market. And the bigger the market, the more hostile it is to alpha. The more liquid the market, the better it is at elimination of alpha. So now and if you're in that bigger market, now it becomes even harder to get alpha, which sends you to an even bigger market, and you're in a vicious circle. There's also a difference between the nature of the game that's being played. In some sense, surfacing an asset is a cooperative game, right? All parties can be better off. Versus trading. In trading, your gain is someone else's loss. That has to be how it works, especially over short time frames. We can all be here and all of you can face forward and listen to me and be hopefully entertained, but in some sense you're all enemies, right? In some sense, in some deep sense. We cannot all win in a market context. For every buyer, there is a seller. And finally, in the last point, I just want to make a deeper point about the invisible hand. So the invisible hand, which, by the way, is a phrase that only appears once in Adam Smith's writing, but has an outsized importance, is trying to say, look, it's trying to deny economic viability, economic profits to certain kinds of activities as a signal. It's trying to say there's not as much value in that activity. And it's trying to guide you. It's a hand. It's physically guiding you towards activities that have higher value, right? And so there has to be some understanding here of how very hard trading as an activity is, right? Making money by trading is extremely difficult. Things that work today will not work tomorrow. There are a number of adversarial pressures that are arrayed against you, some of them right in this room, in physical form. We have to admire not just the people who win in the trading game, but also even the people who lose, because it's a heroic daily effort to compete. And given that, I would just say that there's a sensibility to why a group like us, why Orthogon actually left the markets, right? We left the markets in some sense to better minds and for people who want to compete. And I think that's something I hope that helps people understand where assets come from, why they were created, and what the journey that they took in order for them to get to your screen. That's what I wanted to say. Thanks a lot.